I first met Darren almost exactly 9 years ago at a meeting that took place on this campus, but was a really broad discussion of a lot of fascinating people. I'd only arrived here a couple months before that, talking about the potential for creating a tribal college in the eastern U.S., possibly around here somewhere. And listening to Darren speak at that meeting and then having lunch with him afterwards had a pretty big effect on me. And right around that time, we were trying to grow our capacity to do these sustainability projects and partnerships, and it was very clear to me from the outset that Darren could make enormous contributions to this work because of his deep commitment to serving tribal communities, his ability to align university research with community needs, and to strengthen our collective capacity to create a better world. I've had the privilege of attending many of the meetings that are related to the project that Darren will be talking about in a second. I'll have to figure out how to get this out of the way. And in those meetings, I've not only learned a lot, but it's been a great source of inspiration. So I'm confident you're in for a treat today. So now I'll let Amanda do the second half.
Dr. Ranco is a member of my dissertation committee, and a critical component of my work includes engaging, listening, and integrating Wabanaki perspectives on aspects of natural resource use. And throughout my work and time here at the University of Maine, Dr. Ranco has constantly advocated and ensured that my research incorporates both knowledge to action strategies and create solutions that really represents the Wabanaki perspective. It's my pleasure to introduce him today. Dr. Ranco is a proud citizen of the Penobscot Nation and holds joint appointments in the Department of Anthropology and the George Mitchell Center for Environmental and Watershed Research. He is also chair of Native American programs and coordinator of Native American research. He holds a BA in Anthropology and Classical Studies from Dartmouth College, a Master's of Environmental Law Studies from Vermont Law School, and a PhD in Anthropology from Harvard University. Without further ado, Dr. Darren Ranco.
This is the hardest part for me. Let's start from the beginning this time. All right, good afternoon. I've been told that this works, so hopefully get ESPN or something on it. So hopefully the talk today, this is kind of a hard audience to pitch to, honestly, because some people in this audience know that my project quite well and have heard me present on it before, and other people don't know me and probably don't want to hear all that much from my jokey attitude and are here to actually learn something. So hopefully somewhere in the middle, I do have some issues I've presented on before. I'll touch on many of those, but I do want to really focus on the challenge of doing research around something that is not yet here. So my project is trying to prepare for and even adapt to an invasive pest, an invasive forest pest called the emerald ash borer, which will hugely devastate the cultural resources of Wabanaki peoples who do basketmaking, which is based on brown or black ash trees. And the idea that it's not yet happening, and yet I'm researching it, and we're actually talking about adapting to it, is one of these conundrums I think sustainability science is trying to deal with. But as always, I will make an argument that working with indigenous peoples makes that even more complex, potentially, and if you're trying to serve the interests of sort of non-mainstream cultures, it might also pose some different kinds of questions. So that's what I'll be presenting on today. And I was in Milwaukee this past weekend, and I got to hang out with the bronze fawns, just like me, and the Fonzie's only this. I think in real life he's only that tall, though. So that, to be clear, that's sort of talk about. All right, so identifying. So the goals for today's talk. I want to identify what the emerald ash borer and its potential impact on tribal basketmaking in the state of Maine. think about sustainability science as a research methodology that can be inspired by and work in concert with indigenous research methods. And poor Amanda gets to hear my rantings on that. And then finally, and I don't exactly end with this, I end with some of the results or some of the things that we're doing, but really think about and identify the problems encountered by our research team common to sustainability science related to future-oriented research and problem solving. So this is the little guy here. It's not that big in real life. It's only about an inch long. It's an invasive. It comes from Asia. It was first detected in Detroit in 2002. When it came across, it's most likely in wood shipping pallets in probably the late 80s, early 90s. And it kills all types of ash trees in the way that it reproduces. So it girdles ash trees from inside, and depending on who you read, it can kill anywhere between 98% and 100% of the ash trees that it comes into contact with. So it's a very effective killer of our ash trees, whereas in Asia it tends to do what a lot of pests and borers in particular do, which is it kills trees that are already compromised in some way. Since 2002, it's killed over 100 million trees in 24 states. I only updated that last fall. That's a year old, I think. But there's been no new states. I'm sure it's killed many more trees, though. When we started working on this project in the summer of 2009, the emerald ash borer only existed in the areas marked in blue in the United States. So the areas on this map encapsulated in blue. So in terms of coming eastward, it had just gotten into, in fact, a very, very far western New York. So the idea that, hey, we'll have plenty of time to figure this out. Maybe someone will find some pest, or it'll be controlled by the time it gets to Maine, was maybe an outside hope, but a hope nonetheless. And that, of course, hasn't happened. And as of September 1st, if you want to see its spread, it's spread pretty significantly in the last almost 6 years. And it's now in New Hampshire, and it was discovered in New Hampshire in 2013. So we're probably on a little bit of borrowed time in terms of it is probably, I'm a social scientist, I don't know. I'm sure forest people will say something else, but it's a good chance that we just haven't discovered it, but it's here already in Maine. So partly for your edification as an audience, and partly because I am in the George Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. Is that the right name? See, Amanda, you had it wrong. That's why David almost I do want to define a little bit what the sort of methods and orthodoxies are within sustainability science. And these are, I do these things discursively because these definitions don't all agree with one another, but you can get a feel for how people identify something that's pretty, not contested, but complex in the way that people approach the idea of sustainability science. So one of the classic definitions, looking for indicators of sustainable development, something that I think does really define the way we do it here at the University of Maine, linking knowledge to action. It's a form of knowledge or science that needs to be co-produced through close collaborations between scholars and practitioners, and I think that's something I try to take seriously in my own work, and is credible, salient, and legitimate, which also, from Cash et al., defines sort of, it needs to be in a sweet spot of action and define something that people really care about. So as promised, in my work with Indigenous communities, I do a very particular kind of research which is identified and identifiable as Indigenous research methods. And this isn't that far. I mean, I really want to draw out some of the similarities between our stated goals in Indigenous research methods and the stated goals of many of the sustainability science methods as well. That involves projects that are defined by Indigenous communities, must be collaborative, requires a research ethic that strengthens our communities through healing and the practice of self-determination, recognizes the sacredness and responsibility of maintaining person and community integrity, and these methods are rooted in indigenous epistemologies and ontologies. So the idea of a research method from the ground up that will benefit people is something that we can kind of identify as being shared to a certain extent with sustainability science. So in this context, we, with the threat of the emerald ash borer and these different methods, I worked with a number of people. We assembled a team, and this is just what we called our team. I think I'm going to credit Rob with the titling of this, only because I want to distance myself from it. But so the title up top is what we called our project at the beginning, and I think we shortened it to EAB or Brown Ash or something to keep track of it. I know we were, I think we were Project 13. Is that right, Ruth? Maybe. Yeah, Project 13, even more condensed in terms of sustainability science. And we were very focused on having an interdisciplinary team doing sustainability science. One of the things that I was particularly attentive to and wasn't easy, kind of like a problem for the Mitchell Center. I was like, I want to pay people that just burn trees in the forest. Can we do that or whatever? So we did include the Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance as a PI within the context of our grant, which was very important to me in terms of the line between researcher, practitioner, stakeholder. We're purposely trying to blur those lines, and as well as in the stated goal of the project was to both study and facilitate something. So we weren't pretending to be just bystanders and researching a process unfolding where a pest would just come in and kill a bunch of trees that people care about, but also to really facilitate a response. So we were definitely on that side of the sustainability science quotient, and I'm sure I'd have some of that wrong. Okay. So if you don't know, the Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance, it's a Native American nonprofit, but it probably represents 80 to 85% of the Native basket makers in the state of Maine. Probably anywhere between 150 and 170 people participate across the a year of programming by the Basketmakers Alliance, and they've done a lot of mentoring and development of basket makers over the last 25 years, wherein I believe when they started, the average age of a basket maker was 60 plus. Now the average age is around 40. So it's done a lot, and there were probably just a dozen or two basket makers, and now we're over 150. That they've done this amazing work in facilitating the passing on of a tradition that is both an economic and cultural resource. And you can see that's Molly Neptune Parker, who is one of the master basket makers. You can see some of the examples of this art form, and I don't really have time to go into lists and lists of baskets or whatever, but we can talk about that in Q&A if you want. Unless there is a specific question. I know. I always check in with people. Supposedly that reveals my working class background, that I'm totally not confident in what I'm saying. So make sure you say it's okay, Darren. You can go on.
It's okay, Darren.
Okay. So, and again, we could talk quite a bit about how we've done sustainability science here at the University of Maine. I've been involved in different ways and with different intensity over the last 6 years in terms of identifying and trying to figure out, is there even a University of Maine sort of signature to how we do sustainability science? I do think we take very seriously here the collaborative model of sustainability science. Beyond that, maybe there isn't a shared vision or ethic. But I do think early on we recognized that we had to have two conversations, and that was, what is sustainability science as its own research method? Meaning, is it just the study of sustainable solutions or whatever? Does it have its own method? And I think that we've had some really great discussions about that, as well as the need for interdisciplinarity in a general sense. And I think that discussion has also taken place in different ways and in different intensity across campus. This emphasis on solutions and linking knowledge to action, rethinking research teams as learning organizations, rethinking expertise, who has it and how is it used. I think something that many of the teams that have been working on this have talked about. rethinking how knowledge is prioritized in terms of how do we engage the public, how do we disseminate our knowledge, et cetera, who is it going to impact is something that has been good discussions here. Really rethinking actions and solutions and relationships, both within the university and across our public responsibility as a land grant. These are all, I think, themes within the way we do sustainability science here. And going a bit deeper in terms of what we bring to the table in terms of Indigenous research methodologies, in the reading list that was presented earlier, Robin Kimmerer's work, which I think captures this idea of how we get Western scientific traditions and indigenous knowledge systems to talk to one another and create solutions or new knowledges in terms of that collaboration, is something that Indigenous research methods try to take as its core, some of its core projects. So, as well as the history of research and taking into account the history of research within Indigenous communities and with Indigenous peoples. So there's a history of research that has been tied to the experience of colonization for many Indigenous peoples across the globe. So it seems like we're so researched, and yet we are also the poorest and die the quickest, and et cetera, et cetera. You would think research, if we're all that researched, you'd think would be way better off than we are as Indigenous people. But apparently research doesn't work that way. So we, from an Indigenous perspective, therefore, our methods try to take into account that history of maybe bad relationships with scientists, and that we try to distinguish where our own knowledge traditions are different from Western science traditions, that we use different metaphors in Indigenous languages. How you know something is generally expressed with certain particular terms, and you kind of have to situate yourself. And again, I could probably go on that, but I'll get Roger Paul up here sometime. He can talk about that. And finally, that there is this potentially cultural and spiritual connection between knowledge and especially with what we would consider the natural world, or is there spirit or non-spirit entities at work in the natural world, and how different Indigenous traditions deal with that, something we can and should be sensitive to as researchers. So over the time of doing this project, I've thought a lot about how sustainability science and Indigenous research methods do actually work together, and how we've tried to implement them for our research project on the Emerald Ash Borer. And there is this broad agreement that collaboration and mutual benefit should be principles of both methods. And I think that's a very important, and that each sustainability science and Indigenous research methods go beyond that conventional transfer model of knowledge to user of knowledge. I believe Indigenous research methods emphasize community action, whereas sustainability science favors decision makers. And I put a star next to that because that's in the next section. I'm going to talk more about that. Both agree that research should be open to different forms of knowledge with an understanding of power relationships. I think, again, Indigenous research methods might account for the history of research in a way that sustainability science might not. We should focus on the transformative nature of research, with a greater emphasis on research as a process in Indigenous research methods, perhaps, in terms of the effect of that process on a community. What is the legacy of a research process on it? It is unclear if sustainability science can appreciate non-Western epistemologies or the healing aspects of research. And I'm not the only one that's pointing this out. Sustainability science can often overemphasize large-scale problems and actions to the detriment of particular communities and their needs in terms of research. Interestingly enough, both call for the institutional change for universities, how we define our subject, how do we relate to the public, how do we account for engaged research for the tenure process. Any of those things come up as issues in both sets of methods. So, getting to then, now that I only have 40 more slides, we can get to the meat of, I'm joking, we can get to the meat of this idea of the future and adaptation. So, for us, one of the things that sustainability science allows us to ask is how do we adapt to a future with diminishing ash resources? So it's quite clear the EAB is going to come to Maine. It's going to kill a bunch of ash trees. What do we do now, short, medium, long term, to both make sure that the impact is lessened, as well as how do we adapt to this future with either a lot less or no brown ash or black ash trees. So I would have, in this collage, I would have had me in every picture because it's really about me, but apparently there are other people involved in it. I'm in just two of them. So. And I want to dig down in terms of one of our meetings, and I can't remember if David, you were there at the response planning scenario meeting in May of 2012, and I just want to give you this is where we did the most sort of obvious developed scenario play. So this is how sustainability science often thinks about the future, is that and we had a team that was about developing future scenarios, right? For decision makers by and large, to sort of figure out how would we respond if the environment looks like this in 50 years or that, or in terms of developing what these things look like. And this is as close as we got to that. And this came about, this emergency response scenario planning meeting came about with our group being very worried that once the EAB is here, how will the different partners that we developed over time, how will they respond to it together, and to make sure that. And one of the things that motivated our research was the fact that Indigenous people, cultural minorities, poor people tend to be completely avoided and not dealt with in emergencies like this in terms of responding to a pest. That's something that's sort of just known in invasive pest research. So we wanted to make sure that didn't happen, that basketmakers, who tend to be the ones really calling for action in the state around preparing for the emerald ash borer, that they not be left out of the discussions around how we're going to respond to it and how things like quarantines will work and things like that. So we came up with these three scenarios, and it was really to capture the potential complexity of, say, tribal sovereignty, if something is discovered on or adjacent to tribal lands, if a tribal or non-tribal person discovers it, if it's on state land, if it's on private land. It was to really say, who do you call and how will we collectively communicate in this scenario? So I won't read every single thing, but in scenario one, we have a discovery on Passamaquoddy land, and it's by a particular person, so we're supposed to think through, who is this person, what kind of land is it, et cetera, et cetera. Scenario two, we have a tribal harvester, Eldon Hanning, but he's not on tribal lands. So does that matter? How do we deal with that? And so we talked about this scenario as well. And then something that really didn't involve specifically a tribal person or tribal land on the coast, but how do we think through just, will the tribes or tribal basketmakers be involved in this scenario as well? So we had two that were pretty focused on tribal issues, one that wasn't, but we had representatives from all the state and federal agencies, a couple of private foresters, some nonprofits. Our group consisted of these different kind of entities at different times. Any questions on sort of the context of? So we had we divided people up. It was like one of these classic, everyone wrestle with the problem, and then we bring people together and they discuss it, and we took notes and sort of developed action plans out of what do we need to do to make sure everyone's needs are kind of met at the end of the day. So again, out of this process, out of this day-long emergency response scenario, and there are different ways to do emergency response planning, but this is one of the sort of classic ones. Sometimes it can last for days, if you think about responding to forest fires or anything like that. But at the end of one day, we recognized that we would need a somewhat of a formal agreement, and this is developed. We have now, I'd like to say one of our MOUs is signed with the Penobscot Nation, but it's not clear to me that it's actually the final draft of an MOU regarding these issues has been agreed upon. I don't think it's been signed yet. So this is over 3 years later. The idea of taking time to develop agreements like this is very real. But the primary determination at the end of the day was that we needed, in particular, around issues of sovereignty and how the federal and state roles get played out. And we can talk about state-tribal relations if you want. It's really, really fun stuff. But the idea that there would be a much stronger relationship between the federal government and the tribes when we develop these MOUs is sort of agreed upon, and then sort of hashing out the particular details around that. But so that was the agreed upon sort of like future of what we need to do immediately. What existed kind of as sidelines were a few issues. The fact that we will have diminishing resources, that's obvious, but didn't really fit inside our analysis or our planning. That we'll have a diminished access to resources, also couldn't quite fit it into an MOU. How do we do that? And the need to adapt, store, innovate in terms of the arrival of the emerald ash borer. So how do we deal with then this future, or where we have these last three, but we don't necessarily have an agreement, the parties didn't come together and sort of agree to that. And that, of course, is, we've since applied for grants and gotten some of them to really work on adaptation for something that is not here. So just some of the issues then we've had to deal with in thinking through future-oriented or adaptation-oriented research, and by that I mean doing indigenous research methods or sustainability science in that. And I mentioned this before. The orthodoxy in sustainability science is to engage in sort of future state modeling with decision makers. So you get decision makers because you're trying to educate them about what the future will be, so maybe they can plan for it, et cetera, et cetera. Although scenario development now, thankfully, is often done with stakeholders like our basketmakers and our harvesters and so forth. They tend not to be the people that you say, now here are some scenarios, what will you do about it? We tend to think of that as a decision maker issue. So that's created some tension, I think, in our group. And I wanted to write this down, so I have notes, but I couldn't access them. So I just got an article today, as I say, Poff et al. 2015. Some of the people in this room maybe saw this. They're on the same little damn group as I am. So so this is hot off the presses of sustainability science, and the last phase of their method, which deals with eco-engineering decision scaling program for dams and water. So modeling of the relationship between dams, dam removal, water systems. The last phase of that, like most sustainability science, is to have decision makers at the table decide how to move into this future. So as a man of the people, I'm like, no, we don't always want decision makers, the ones that are remodeling or responding. We all should be responding, and maybe in different ways, but how do we do that? So that's one issue that I've been trying to think through, as well as what was left on the table or left off the table when we talked about these future states. Another thing that we talk about in sustainability science is that these scenarios are stories, right? That's the best way to think. Or they're pictures, or they're little ditties we tell each other, like, what's a scenario? Oh, it's just a thing we can kind of communicate a future. And that they should have a consistent logic and take into account evolving positions and power balance of stakeholders, which I think is good. And I'm getting this right from one of the early, really smart articles about thinking about the future and future modeling. But how do we do that if it's always oriented towards decision makers? How do we then think about power and the power balance between decision makers and stakeholders if we're always orienting it towards decision makers? Another thing and this is very evident in all the meetings when we started talking about the future adaptation, is that there's a competency called anticipatory competence. Who has that? Anticipatory competence. That obviously there's a way to train for or think about or encourage the people you're working with in sustainability science to get more competent at this particular idea of thinking in the future and future states. But this exists across all stakeholders, but stems from very different experiences and knowledges. So tribal basket makers have a very different anticipatory prediction system than a state regulator or private forester, and based upon their experience with the state, with being shut out or included in particular decision making in the past. And so how do we then reckon with this different experience or these sort of different scaling effects of anticipatory competence? So that's another question. Another thing, and I think this has probably delayed some of our progress over for MOUs over the last year or two, is problem ownership. Who has ownership over a particular problem? I think in sustainability science, people have written about situations where it's been motivated by the researchers, right? So the researchers go out and try to assemble a bunch of stakeholders, and you're going to get together no matter what you do. The people are like, oh, get away, we don't want to talk to you. Or sometimes it can be, of course, stakeholders coming to research. So who owns the problem has a lot to do with how we think about the future as well. And for us, I think the urgency of this future arriving soon or late, or in that feeling of things, was always, I always felt like the agency people wanted us as the research team to write everything for them because they're like a little unsure. And I was like, well, I'm not a regulator. I'm just a researcher. Maybe you and the people you're having an agreement with should write it. So there was just a sense of who had expertise, who had ownership over the problem or solution. These are things that also matter when we talk about these future conditions. Number 5, future problems usually involve defining resilience. So again, I could put on a whole slide of different ways of defining resilience. It's another term of art that we use in sustainability science. I am influenced by some of the cultural geographers, and McKinnon and Derrickson are two that have been working on sustainability science a little bit, that see that resilience itself is bound up with certain kinds of neoliberal modes of governance. I knew you all would say, like, what's a neoliberal mode of governance? You could ask some of the anthropologists in the room. But this idea that the resilience is based upon a current state of affairs where the nation state has a sort of preemptive kind of control over things, and resilience is sort of based on how different groups are able to access those particular approaches and resources to kind of continue to exist or access certain things. And so that it tends to reinforce or reemphasize the current power dimensions or state of affairs for most definitions of resilience. They beg us to not use that term so much, but come up with resourcefulness maybe as a concept, which is, and this is very common with environmental justice work that sometimes I do as well, that as opposed to saying what will make us more resilient, what institutions need to be in place or extended over time, we have to ask the question, to where are we going and from what are we going? If our current state is completely unjust, where we have no access to things, the idea that, well, let's just start our discussion of resilience here in this current horrible state is a really bad game for Indigenous people and other groups who don't have access to that kind of neoliberal operation that currently manages our resources. And then lastly, in terms of the problems and opportunities, and this is really the only one that's probably an opportunity, is that sustainability science approaches to adaptation help with establishing dialogues to share and co-create findings, goals, decision points, can mobilize public and private resources, create a knowledge exchange, and this. I didn't just write this slide like 20 minutes ago. It was more like an hour ago. So I apologize for the grammatical thing. And can facilitate the discussion of equity issues created by disparate impacts of a particular problem. So there is this element that doing sustainability science has some insight and possibility to work with future states and decision making as well. This is a slide of Eldon, who supplies maybe 40% of all the basketmakers. He and his son supply probably brown ash, black ash materials to about 40% of the basketmakers in the state. So now I'm moving back to things that we, despite these problems, and I wish I had connected all this a little bit more readily for you, things that we have come up in terms of adaptation, but they exist both kind of, again, on and off that table of issues that we developed in that scenario day and at other times, talking with different stakeholders in the process. So I'm just going to come up with a list of things that we're doing and we're thinking through in terms of adaptation, and I'll end this with saying, oh, it's all beautiful and we're going to win the day, but you all know that that's not true. I would just say that it's an ongoing process, and it's, if anything, a constant renewal and checking in that we always wish we had more time for and more ability to kind of carry out. So one of the things that we've been working on, and David and I and others have been discussing, is the idea that we'll come up with these adaptation pilot projects because of this short and medium term issue around not having enough resources or a diminishing set of resources. How might we capitalize on the fact that we have good networks in place, we have relationships being built between scientists, engineers, and native people trying to wrestle with this emerging pest here. What can we do in the very short term and medium term that will help people adapt to the material needs issues, the technology issues of maybe storing brown or black ash resources, making sure that current stocks are not infected or are made available to be infested by the pest, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a real open-ended, creative process that we're really been trying to jumpstart in the last 6 months to a year. Related, but I think a different thing, is trying to locate and access new ash locations. The tribal harvesters of brown or black ash resources tend to have places that they've traditionally gone to access trees. Well, what if that's in the zone that is infected first? How do we identify basket quality ash trees for basket makers on lands that they would have potentially access to, as well as, can we develop some sort of forestry tool to help them locate where these might be? A number of people have been working on this. Bill Livingston, his students, a number of people have been doing really good work on it, but it involves not just using forestry mapping techniques, but involves interviewing basket makers in terms of what they're looking for a basket quality tree, et cetera, et cetera. The findings have been positive. I think we've discovered probably a little bit more black ash and maybe even basket quality black ash than we would have expected. And for future research, we're looking to make agreements with large landowners in the state of Maine to allow for access to these forest certified lands, and forest certification itself recognizes Indigenous people and Indigenous access to these kinds of resources. So, yeah.
I just want to say black ash and brown ash are synonymous.
Yes, they are the same thing. Everyone else, the popular name for Fraxinus nigra is everywhere except for Maine, it's black ash, and in Maine it's called brown ash. Sorry, yes. I just knew maybe some foresters would be like, that's not brown ash, it's black ash. Anyway, it's the same tree. Yeah. One element in terms of adaptation, this is very much the cultural adaptation side of things, is we're documenting the traditional gathering methods. We've developed an archive of videos of basket makers and harvesters going into the forest, talking through what they're looking for, talking through the stories that define the tradition for them, but especially in the forest, what to look for. And this archive is owned by the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance, and for the use of future basket makers. We don't yet have a scenario, although we'll be working on this over the next year. Will part of this be publicly available to researchers or not? That's not its original intent. It's very much to have an interface and an archive for a future of tribal basket makers where maybe they don't have any ash trees around, but they might return. How do we keep this and pass on this knowledge? So that's really the purpose of the archive. And that's been one of these just great opportunities that meet the goals of many different people within the research process. We've done some work on seed collection and storage. I think this might come back again. There are different opportunities for a future without brown ash trees. How might we then propagate trees after the emerald ash borer threat has gone beyond Maine, or natural systems have responded to it. Just wanted to point out that it's hard work getting brown ash seed, and as it has one of the longest times between seedings of any tree in the forest. It can be 5 to 7 years before it reseeds, so it doesn't happen all that much. So being aware of when that happens across the forest is one of the challenges of collecting seed. The biggest thing that really is defined in our MOUs is this network and communication when people find out and when they can participate jointly in defining not just, is the EAB here in Maine, but also how will we respond to it? How will we even, and this is part of the MOUs, how will we study the extent of a particular infestation? Was really we really want to make sure that basket makers and harvesters are involved in that process if they want to be, and so there isn't this sort of hide the ball element. There's a lot of mistrust, again, depending on the agency and depending on the people. So being inclusive is really important to the group. And lastly, and I think probably doing okay on time then, lastly, it just comes back around to these deep partnerships and relationships, and it's just a picture of a trip we did with some of the local harvesters and basket makers, Jennifer Neptune of the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance, Kelly Church of the Michigan Basket Makers Alliance, Suzanne Greenlaw, who's a graduate student here, that we really develop these deep relationships over time. And in some ways, that's the best thing we could probably leave behind in terms of future states of things. That if we think about what's both the purpose of sustainability science and indigenous research methods, we think about the transformative elements of that. It's probably its best work that it does is to shrink the social distance between different peoples with different sets of knowledge and different interests. And I think that very purposeful work will help us not with just this thing. And I hear this from tribal elders that, of course, this is our issue right now, emerald ash borer, but there'll be another issue after that and then another one after that. And really, the better we can do in terms of building up relationships, communication, partnerships in the now will set us up for responding in a more sustainable way to future problems as well. So that's it. Thank you.
Can you say a little bit more about the adaptation strategies that are being explored and kind of
Sure.
what stage you're at and what it'll take to make headway there?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of discussions, and I think that anxiety of diminishing resource and access to resource was with us right from the very beginning. In 2009, that was one of the, we did when we brought everyone together, we did one of these, strategic planning thing. Everyone here loves strategic planning. I know you do. The secret lover of strategic. So, you put issues on a board, and then we all got little stickers, and I have 5 stickers. I'm going to put them all over here on studying Darren or whatever. So we did that, and resource access, the ability to maintain the resource, was always ranked really high over time. And sort of how do we, and in a way, it's been one of those things that both the state and federal regulators are not entirely comfortable with, because the way that indigenous people talk about it. And I think this is where I think really seeing forest certification might create this common ground for how to think about resource access, is that Native people see it as a treaty or cultural right, and then other people see it as a property interest, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the anxiety around that as an issue has been with us all along. So when we're faced with the shortage, potential shortage of resources, we're really looking at, and we've been discussing things like, once it comes to the state, do you just cut every tree down and store it in some big freezer or underwater? These are all things that we've been, and has been researched. The underwater element has been researched in 3 or 4 papers in terms of Michigan and Minnesota. They've looked at how long can you store it. On this trip where this picture was taken, we actually processed a couple of logs that had been stored underwater for 8 weeks to make sure that, of course, that would be protecting it from the EAB, but if you pull it out of the water and you can't process the wood, that doesn't really help us any. So that seemed to be really easily processed at the 8-week mark. That tends to be sort of the over-under that will kill the EAB too, that 8 weeks underwater will kill the pest as well. So the idea that there are these discussions and sort of how do you protect a resource or at least manage for it. We're also involved in a project with the Forest Service, just funded us to bring tribal brown and black ash harvesters from Michigan, New York State, and Maine to kind of create a network of where they can share resources, not just the technology or educational resources, but literally share brown ash trees and create an exchange network. So we're going to be bringing people together over the next 2 years to figure out how to manage that. That would probably require some more money, but at least they're supporting this idea that together maybe across a larger region, and I know Kelly has complained that just in the last 2 years, even though it's been in Michigan for a long time, just in the last 2 years, their ability to access any resources has been, it's like finding the needle in the haystack kind of thing. So they're really being impacted in that way. So that's where we're at with some of the elements and discussions around it. Yeah.
I have a question about deep partnerships and
Yeah.
relationships. I like that concept, and you obviously are demonstrating some of that here. That seems like it's really dependent on long-term relationships. But that's something that seems difficult to do in an academic setting where you're constrained by often fairly short funding cycles.
No.
So how do you navigate that? And for those of us who are interested in developing sort of deep relationships and partnerships, what's your advice to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the strategies, and I think the Mitchell Center has been good, and David and others have been really good at, is to try to think of metrics that can measure these things, as opposed to just treating it merely as a black box cultural category of like, I just feel good, so that's NSF, give me more money so I can feel good, that kind of thing. So I think really thinking through and articulating, and I think the funding agencies are trying to be better at, at different times and in different ways, to be like, yeah, this shows progress of knowledge development that maybe it's not a peer-reviewed publication. It might be something else. Maybe it's an MOU. There are other indicators of sustainability, indicators of partnership and collaboration that, but that's a political and lifelong kind of fight around things. I think seeking out other people that are wrestling with these issues as well. So you're here, so you're already pretty much doing that as well. There's no simple answer. I think I think the interdisciplinary elements of it help with that as well. I read some interesting articles recently, and I'm really trying to work on a publication that kind of calls on a lot of this of these matters. And they were talking about how the ecologists that are publishing in sustainability science actually aren't as interdisciplinary as, say, the social scientists that tend to do it, that because there is a less of an elaborated kind of game of sustainability science in both things like economics, but other social scientists like myself who are working on these issues, that we tend to be citing very broadly and creating these interdisciplinary networks. And that's, I think, a hopeful thing in terms of, again, indicating sustainability, showing this sort of broad approach to engaging in societal problems within the academy. I think that's also part of our picture. Other questions?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but so the way I understand it is that the basketmakers themselves only use the brown and black ash as their resources, but does this insect affect non-ash and white ash and all the other ash?
Yes, it does.
So how are you protecting those other ashes that aren't specifically needed as resources for basketmakers?
So, and what's interesting is the lack of priority those trees actually have in the state of Maine. So ash is only about 4% of our forest here in the state, and of course brown or black is a small percentage of that. We've engaged with a number of the obvious sort of forestry groups in the state, and they don't seem to be all that worried about it. Recently, just in the last year and a half, I think because of the Maine State Forest Service urging, towns, municipalities have started to really come into the fold on being very worried about the impact of this pest on public forest resources, in particular towns. And because after the Dutch elm disease killed all the elm trees, we replaced all those with ash trees. So, so that's good, smart thing. So, the idea that we now have sort of replaced that not quite in a monoculture way, but in terms of like certain towns, it's like 50% of the trees. I believe in Presque Isle, all the public like trees in the streets are all ash trees, like 100%. So, the idea that these towns will be facing sort of economic and other kinds of issues based upon an invasive pest has meant that they are starting to really, participate in some of because we're trying to talk through adaptation and planning for things. But it exists beyond us. I mean, the other thing is that we never claimed, early on we wanted everyone to kind of work together, but it was definitely the tribal basketmakers who were carrying the most. It was actually a real conundrum for the first 2 or 3 years of our grant. We'd be like, how come people won't come to the table? We talked to, the president of the thing, of the blah, 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 and they're like, yeah, so what? Just the idea that it doesn't occupy ash trees in the state, just don't occupy enough economic or other kind of clout, and it's really, a cultural and economic resource that's really important to the tribes and to basketmakers. We've been working with the kind of key group, but in the last year and a half, I would say 2 years, maybe the municipalities have started being more present, and we're not even at all those meetings. Like the State Forest Service has been doing some trainings in different. I think there's like 4 or 5 municipalities across the state.
Well, if you have more questions, please hang around, but let's stop right here and thank Darren again for a great talk.
Thank you.